Indian summer.
Good afternoon. Welcome to an Indian Summer Festival online. My name is Geoff Rowe. I'm the director of Leicester Comedy Festival, and it's great to be here this afternoon as part of the Indian Summer Festival. And I'd like to introduce you to our special guest this afternoon, Nish Kumar.
Hi, Geoff. Hi, everybody.
Hi. This is a bit weird, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, of course. Well, it is both. It both is and isn't, because I've been living my life in a room that is, I mean, at this point, mainly comprised of my own flatulence. I've been living in this box, working from a screen for the last however many weeks it's been. So it's both. But it's good to occasionally remind yourself that this is weird and try not to get too used to this.
Yeah. Have you arranged for a small child to run in at some point, and so you can shoo them out the room?
Oh no, I'm constantly trying to. I don't have a child myself to create that sort of viral content, and I've learned that if you ask people to borrow their children, they look at you like you're some sort of weirdo.
Yeah. Okay. So how's lockdown been for you? Has it?
Well,
do you remember the last live show that you did before all of this nonsense happened?
Yeah. I mean, I think I did. I remembered I did a couple of sort of gigs that you didn't really think too much about. Just little gigs in and around London, a couple of charity things. But you certainly weren't aware. I think the weird thing about live stuff is when you start as a comedian, one of the things that you're constantly told by senior people in your profession and various people that advise you is to always maintain your live work, because that's the reliable thing, and you don't ever want to be in a situation where you're completely at the whims of the vicissitudes of television commissioning. And so you're constantly told to furnish your live work, because that's the thing that will look after you as your career goes on and on. And so it is a slightly weird thing for that to just disappear, and the idea of gigs to not exist anymore. I have done an open air gig, a drive-in gig.
Oh, I knew you'd done that. I was going to ask you, what was it like?
Well, it was actually really fun. It was.
You
really
want to just
fun.
Explain to people how it worked if they don't know?
Yeah, so there's a string of them that's springing up all over the country, and this one was in the car park of a shopping centre in northwest London, and you sort of arrive, and it's this kind of music festival style stage, and then people drive up in their cars, and they can, I guess, depending on the weather, either sit on the cars, or some of them bought picnic furniture and sat around the cars, and some of them stayed in the car. But it was a wild experience. But when they asked me to do it, I sort of thought, I kind of want to see what this is like. I kind of want to have this experience. And there definitely was a sense that the audience were aware that this was an odd position for me to be in as a performer, and so was slightly overcompensating. I'd constantly look out into the audience and just see people going, "It's going well. Keep at it, buddy."
People honked their horns and stuff, didn't they? I think.
Well, they actually weren't honking their horns at this one, because there was some noise complaint issues. So, but we do so many music festival gigs that you're actually, you realise once you start that this is not hugely different to those. I mean, obviously it's not going to be the same as being indoors, but you'd much rather be performing to an audience that aren't concerned for their safety.
Yeah. And was it sort of, how sort of celebratory was it? How much did you get the impression that people were just going, "Oh, thank God we're out of our houses and we can actually do something that's different"? Or was it just not like that?
No, you definitely got the sense that people were relieved to see some entertainment. You definitely got the sense that people are hungry for it. I think nobody wants to risk their safety for the sake of a comedy gig, and nor should they. I mean, don't get me wrong, Geoff. I'm an excellent comedian, but I am not worth risking your health for, unless Richard Pryor's Ghost starts doing the circuit. I'm not sure there's a comedian that I'd want to risk my safety for. But you can definitely feel that people are, there is a thirst for entertainment.
Yeah. And how much have you kind of kept up or done yourself? There's been quite a lot of online comedy during lockdown, and I think the jury's probably still out about which of it is good, which of it is not so good. I think we're probably all in agreement. It's nowhere near as good as live comedy. But have you kept up with much of that stuff? Have you seen any stuff?
Yeah, I've been doing I've done a few things. I did a charity gig for Ben and Matthew from Pappy's, who do a fundraiser every year for the community theatre in Wolverhampton that they used to go to when they were kids. And so we did a fundraising gig, and I did, I've done James Gill's Always Be Comedy, which is a lovely gig in real life and is proving to be a fun gig in lockdown as well. And there's quite a few that I've done. Kiri Pritchard McLean was running the COVID Arms, which was really good fun. To be honest, quite a few of them were fun. And I mean, I think nobody's under the illusion that this is better than doing gigs, but it was still enjoyable. And to be honest, because we did the MASH report during the lockdown, I sort of got quite used to just performing to absolute silence, looking into a camera in my room. And so in a strange way, the Zoom gigs don't hold. I did one very early in the lockdown. It may even have been the COVID Arms. And I remember feeling really concerned about it. I actually know it was XS Malarkey in Manchester, which is another fantastic gig. And I remember feeling really nervous about it. But after 6 weeks of sitting alone in my room, feeling slightly like I was having a nervous breakdown, just speaking into a camera, you definitely became more comfortable. And it changes your rhythms. There's a sort of technical challenge from a writing perspective of how you construct comedy that doesn't have an audience. And we certainly learned a lot in the first week or two of the MASH.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to focus today, really, I guess, on your comedy career and how you got going, what you think about the comedy industry, a couple of bits and pieces. So I'm kind of interested. I've done a few of these over the years, interviewing different sorts of comedians, really. And did you grow up with comedy when you were a kid? Did you watch it on telly? Were your family into comedy? Can you just, before you became a comedian or a performer or whatever, we'll come on to that into a bit, but did you consume a lot of comedy when you were growing up?
Yes, obsessively. When I was a kid, comedy was sort of a big part of our household. My parents and I actually spent a lot of time of all places, Geoff. I actually spent a lot of time in Leicester when I was growing up, because my grandparents, my mum's from Leicester, and my grandparents moved there in the 70s, and so we spent a lot of time as a family watching old British sitcoms. I've probably seen every single episode of. I mean, I've definitely seen every single episode of Fawlty Towers, but I've probably seen every single episode of Only Fools and Horses, and all the kind of the sort of staples of British sitcoms from the 70s and 80s. And for me personally, the big things when I was a kid were things like Red Dwarf. We were all obsessive. I queued for 2.5 hours to meet Chris Barry in the Whitgift Centre in Croydon. Probably in sort of 1995, maybe. And then I was a huge fan of The Simpsons. I must have started watching, just because the age I am, I'm absolutely bang in the middle of The Simpsons core demographic, because I was about 5 or 6 when I started watching it. And so I don't really remember life before The Simpsons. I don't have enough of a memory to understand what my brain was like before I started watching The Simpsons. And so, I used to do that. And then, goodness gracious me, it was like a huge and significant thing for the Asian community. For Asians of my generation, it was a huge and significant cultural moment that I think gave us permission to be comedians. I think the generation of comedians that you now see, and including me, Ramesh, Sindhu, you Bisha Ali, like you as soon as you see those people and understand, you're seeing the real legacy of that TV show.
And did you watch a lot of that stuff with your family?
Some of it, yeah. Some of it, goodness gracious me, we were given special dispensation. In the early 90s, it was, if there was an Asian on the television, someone would shout from the front room, be like, "Oh my God, there's an Indian on TV," and so everyone would just like rush in to see what was going on. And like my mum grew up in England in the 70s, and she grew up watching films where Peter Sellers would be playing an Indian man with some dubious makeup. And so the idea that this show existed that specifically referenced those Peter Sellers things, because I mean the title and the theme tune were taken from those shows, and it had a real sort of punk year zero impact on a lot of us. But also it was something that my family did together. The first live comedy show I ever went to see was the Goodness Gracious Me live show at the Hackney Empire in 1999. And it's sort of, I've no doubt that is one of the key things that set me on a course towards being a comedian. But also I used to watch stuff. My parents didn't really care for The Simpsons particularly, but me and my brother were obsessive about that. And there was a book that came out that was like an episode guide to The Simpsons. And I just used to obsessively read the episode guide, and they would break down jokes and references to pop culture references. And I think that in retrospect, it was definitely having a real impact on me. And I was definitely in part thinking, fascinated by the idea of how the things got put together, how comedy worked. And so in retrospect, the die was cast pretty early on for me. So
to the point that at what age did you think I could be a comedian, I could tell jokes, I can make people laugh? Did you think, can you remember a time when you weren't going to become a comedian?
Definitely. I mean, I think from when I was a teenager, I remember seeing a Chris Rock HBO special. I remember seeing that and thinking, well, that is the coolest man in the world, surely. And I definitely, when I was a kid, I definitely liked sort of the idea of being funny in front of groups of people. But I still didn't think there was any way that it would end up being my career. I think when I was about 17, 18, I definitely remember thinking I would absolutely love to be a stand-up. But in the same way that I thought I would absolutely love to be Spider-Man, it was a sort of nebulous ambition, but I didn't really have a sense about how you would become a comedian. And then I went to university, and I joined, I went to a freshers fair, and they said, oh, there's this sketch comedy thing that you can do that lets you go to Edinburgh. And I knew of the existence of the Edinburgh Fringe. And by the time I had left school, I had started going to watch comedy in comedy clubs. My uncle and aunt used to sneak me in when I was 16 to comedy clubs that I was definitely not allowed into.
Don't tell anyone.
Yeah, they used to just walk me in. Yeah, he's 18. This kid's definitely 18.
You want a pint, Nish?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Of water. But he's driving. That's why. He's 18. And then I went to this freshers fair. They said, oh, you can go to Edinburgh. So then I auditioned, and then I didn't get in my first year, and then I did get in my second year. And I think when I went to Edinburgh, that was the first time that I understood a little bit about roughly how the comedy circuit works. And then you start hearing about that there's comedy clubs everywhere, and Friday and Saturday nights all over the country, people are going to watch live shows. And this is Edinburgh, and people then do bits on TV. And so I started to see the infrastructure a bit more. But before I went to Edinburgh, certainly, or maybe even around the time I first started going to comedy clubs, I definitely had no sense of how it all worked. And so the ambition of being a comedian seemed sort of, pie in the sky, far-fetched thing.
It's interesting that you said that about, I think you said Spider-Man. We did a project in the Comedy Festival back in February when you could do kind of live stuff. and we did a project with some school kids, some primary school kids, and they absolutely identified being funny with being a superpower,
Right.
like Superman, like Spider-Man, whatever. You know, making people laugh was a superpower. It was something that superheroes do. So
Yeah.
I was interested that you should say that. So did you say when you started off it was an improv comedy?
No, it was sketch.
Sketch.
I started off in a university sketch group, the
Okay.
most maligned of all the subgenres of comedy.
If only it had been improv, eh? It would put you up a bit.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first time you went on stage and kind of tried to make people laugh?
Yeah, I definitely remember the first show that I did in the review, because it was in the basement of our student union, and we'd write a new hour every term and put it on somewhere around the uni town, and then we'd take the best of those 3 hours and then take that to Edinburgh. But the first term, I was so delighted to get in, and so delighted to be just in an environment where all I was doing was making jokes and doing comedy and all that kind of stuff. It hadn't really occurred to me that I actually had to do it in front of people. And so the first term, I hadn't really thought, I knew intellectually that the show was happening, but I don't think I understood it emotionally. And then suddenly on the night, I suddenly remember thinking, what am I doing? Like, what in the name of God, what has possessed me to think this is a good idea? And I think possibly I would have run away, but unfortunately I was sewn into a giant T-shirt with one of my fellow sketch performers because we were playing Conjoined Twins.
Of course.
A sketch that I imagine was in poor taste even at the time. The benefit of hindsight is not needed to establish that was potentially in poor taste.
But you kept doing it. You didn't afterwards when you got out of the T-shirt. You didn't run away. You could have run away at that point.
No, I mean the first show went very well. Of course it did. It was largely the audience was largely people we were friends with.
Yes.
And then after that, I sort of thought, yes, there's no going back. The first gig went well, and then and then you do another gig and that goes well, and then you sort of go to Edinburgh, and suddenly, obviously, you're performing to people who've paid and they don't know you, and so then it goes. But the experience was incredible, and you have good gigs, then you have bad gigs, and I think when you've really stunk up a comedy gig, there's very little like a bad comedy gig. A bad play is one thing, but there's very little worse than for performer and audience than experiencing a comedy gig that's tanking. But I think when your first impulse after you've stank up a show is to think, how can I put that right, rather than I must never do that again. What on earth possessed me? That's when I think, I'm in this for the long haul. And then the year after I started doing stand-up, and as soon as I started doing stand-up, I thought, well, this is absolutely the life for me.
Yeah. So just to kind of give people a bit of context, I suppose, you talked about Simpsons and Goodness Gracious Me and all of that growing up. When you were going to Edinburgh for the first time, who would you have seen? Who were the kind of the comedians that were around at that point?
Well, who were they? I mean, there was a sketch group called We Are Clang, which was Greg Davis, Marek Larwood, and Steve Hall, and they were doing a show in a sort of 80-seat room in the Pleasance Courtyard, and it was it was a porter cabin, and so if you can imagine Greg Davis in a porter cabin, like he barely fit height wise. I swear to God, they had to extend the ceiling for him. But I remember watching that and thinking, well, this is, I must have watched that show 5 or 6 times in my first year in Edinburgh. And the sort of, around that period, there were people who were, bubbling under TV, but weren't on TV. Like I remember seeing Mickey Flanagan with about 40 people and thinking, well, this man is extremely funny. Reg D. Hunter was sort of, was like the big Edinburgh comic just before he sort of broke through as a television comedian, but he was a sort of big comedian. I saw Stuart Lee in 2007 doing 41st Best Stand-Up of All Time, doing that show. and again, he was sort of somebody who was very much at the top of the Edinburgh hierarchy at that point, but it was still before, it was still been a good few years before Comedy Vehicle. And then there were people like, someone like Josie Long, which is so funny because Josie and I are virtually the same age. She's only a couple of years older than me, but because she's one of these kind of prodigies who started doing comedy when she was 11 or something ridiculous.
Yeah.
She was sort of, I think she won Best Newcomer in 2006. And so she was this odd figure because she seemed to be part of the established, respected comedians, but also she was kind of our age. And she seemed to be speaking in a language that we recognisably understood as being someone from our generation. And so that was obviously also very cool and exciting. And, really sort of really inspiring person in those early years in Edinburgh, particularly for me.
You said a while ago, you started doing sketch-based comedy, and then you started doing stand-up, and then you realise that there's this whole comedy scene out there, and there's gigs happening in the country and all that kind of thing. What I'm interested in, I've asked a lot of people, and I'd be interested in your point of view, is how did you find out where to perform? How did you? I mean, I'm guessing, and this shows my age, I'm guessing the internet was around at this point. When I started, there was no internet. But how do you? I don't know. Is there any advice to give to people about how you get started? How do you go you go to Edinburgh, you have a crack in Edinburgh, you think this is for me. What do you do next?
Well, what I then did next was, I think Marek Larwood may have given Ed Gamble, Gamble and I were in the Durham Review together. I think Marek Larwood gave Ed a bunch of phone numbers for open mic nights in London. And that seems to be quite a common thing, is that when you start, I mean, now I'm guessing nobody phones. I mean, we were phoning landlines, so I'm guessing that that's out now. So I'm assuming now somewhere there's an email list with email addresses that you can email, but the system seems to still be the same. You sort of need to find somebody. There's no use finding somebody who's long off the open mic circuit, because open mic gigs are constantly just appearing and disappearing. And I remember even after I'd been doing it for about 5 or 6 years, I remember giving somebody, a newer comic, my list of contacts, and all those gigs no longer existed. So you need to get a hold of somebody who's just off the open mic circuit and has just started doing paying gigs, because they'll still know all the contacts. But so I think my memory of it is that Marek gave Ed some numbers, and then Ed and I started phoning around and just trying to get gigs, and then sort of you just sort of turn up, and you used to look through. There would sort of be listings in Time Out, and you would just sort of look online, try and Google where open mic nights were happening, and then you sort of have to call people and then send out emails and then sort of start just turning up places. It's an odd few. The first couple of years are very strange.
Yeah. I feel very young and hip now, because I think you'll find these days you need to join a WhatsApp group.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And list. I think that, or a Facebook group, maybe. Definitely. Get on those. I love the fact that you thought there should be an email list. I think.
Yeah. Of course, it's a WhatsApp group.
and what about your kind of material, your persona, your comedy voice? How do other people do that, but how did you do that? How did you decide what you were going to tell jokes about and what your comedy was going to be about?
Well, I think certainly when I started, I was looking at somebody like Chris Rock and thinking, I'm interested in doing comedy about social issues. But I could, the easiest place to start is just with stories from your life. And the truth is, the way that I found the persona was by basically spending a couple of years just being a rip-off act of about 6 or 7 different people. There was always a bit of Chris Rock in there. Then, like everyone my age, there was a sort of phase where I was just, plagiarizing Stuart Lee. There was, everybody went through a bit of a Daniel Kitson phase. There were a lot of, you were sort of trying anything to sort of make it work, and you would just try everything, and slowly over time you shed those personas and you shed those influences, and then you keep little pieces of them, and then you start to develop an onstage presence that is recognizably your own, but always carries little echoes of the people that you were most inspired by when you started out. I mean, also there are people who you just think are amazingly funny, but you realize one of the first comedian I ever saw do a solo show was Ross Noble. But I never felt that I would be able to do what he did. It's a strange thing. It's an odd thing, because I don't know why. I don't know why I looked at Chris Rock and thought, yeah, I'll have a crack at that. I don't know what level of arrogance and delusion drove me to look at Chris Rock and think, well, yes, I can give that a go. But also while I was at university, I was just pouring everything that I could possibly pour into my brain. And so I got all the Pryor albums. There's that box set that's a kind of all the Warner Brothers albums, and then Live in Concert and Sunset Strip, and then you start listening to all the when I was on the open mic circuit, it was kind of 2007, 8, 9. That was the start of loads of comedy podcasts.
Yeah.
And so there was an opportunity to listen to 2-hour-long conversations with people as they explained how they became comedians. And so that was actually really important and really very helpful for me.
Yeah. So that we're sticking to the rehearsed script that we've agreed in advance, because that leads us nicely to my next question, which is around the I'm interested, and I think other people are interested in the industry side of it. So we've talked a bit about getting gigs, and we've talked a bit about how you develop your own material. Presumably, as you started out and you started to do better and better, managers, agents, producers, people in the industry started to contact you. Can you just tell us a bit about that, and how did you know which manager to go with? How did you know who was a good tour booker? All that kind of stuff. Because I think within comedy, within stand-up comedy in particular, it's not like if you're an actor, you could go to drama school and you could be taught some of this stuff. If you're going to be an electrician, you'd know it. But stand-up, I think, is still this kind of unknown world where people don't necessarily know what the difference between an agent and a manager is.
Well, the first sort of agents I had Edinburgh was really the route to getting representation for me. I don't know that it's the same now, because I'm now talking about 12, 13 years ago, and there are much more avenues through, internet stuff. And I think also there are people who maybe are watching more stuff in other festivals and gigs around London. But certainly for me, the route in was Edinburgh. So we would go up and do a free stand-up show in 2008 and 9. I did sort of briefly have an agent who sent me up for some like acting auditions, but that and I did learn a lot from that particular interact. Like it wasn't a particularly great relationship for me, and I learned a lot about, in retrospect, about what I did and didn't want to do. I've talked about this on stage before, so I'm not really breaking any new ground, but in sort of 2007, after I'd done a show, I had an agent that sent me up for some auditions, and a lot of them were for, some of them were cool things, but a lot of them were for like the sort of lame Asian guy. It'd be a badly written Asian character. And the reason I stopped working with that agent was because she was insisting that I do a sort of comedy Indian accent for an audition. And I said I wouldn't do it. And that was the end of that relationship. Because she thought I was, being uppity, but I was unwilling to, I was unwilling to sell out my ethnicity for, a background part in a shitty sitcom. And so I learned a lot from that. I learned a lot about how you have to carry yourself and how you have to, and how you make decisions that at the time it did feel quite damaging. And, it did feel a bit like, oh my God, I'm back to square zero with all of this. And then I used to sort of keep going to Edinburgh and doing free stand-up shows. And really through Edinburgh, you eventually get to know who people's agents are. And then you sort of go through this period where you try emailing agents and none of them get back to you. And then, then they start sort of turning up to gigs that you're doing in Edinburgh. And I was friends with Ed and people who had agents and got signed. So you sort of meet people through doing that. But my first agent was somebody who I met because he was working as a live booker for Ed Gamble with Ed's management company. Ed's still managed by Avalon, and he was working for Avalon. And then he signed me when he became an agent, and he moved to Phil McIntyre, who are an agency and touring company. And so I had met him years previously, and so he'd seen me over a number of years. And eventually I did just email him and say, look, I'm looking for some sort of representation. But the reality is that things only started to improve for me when I slightly let go of some of those, when I stopped obsessively thinking about the career progression and started focusing on getting better as a comedian. And I think I was so obsessed with getting my career started that I'd forgotten to not be shit at comedy. And that is a really important lesson. That was a really important lesson. I was so focused on, why am I not getting anywhere? And especially when you're, 22, 23, you don't, or certainly I didn't have the capacity for any self-reflection. And what I slowly started to do was realize that a lot of the material I was doing was rubbish and I didn't like any of it. And so I just had to start writing from scratch. And it's sort of been around 2010. There's a sort of tipping point where I thought I might stop doing stand-up because I'd just been sort of at it for 3 years and nothing had happened. And, I'd seen friends of mine get into kind of industry showcase things in Edinburgh, and I'd failed at those auditions and no agents were replying to me. And I'd started doing some work with Tom Neenan, who I was also in the review with, and writing sort of sketch double act stuff. And so in around 2010, I remember thinking, well, maybe I'll try and focus on this. Like maybe I'll try and do some writing and then maybe come back to stand up. And then sort of in 2010, a friend of mine had to give up a free fringe slot because he'd got, this is all very like boring Edinburgh stuff, but he had got a showcase in Edinburgh that meant that he couldn't do a free fringe slot. And so he basically gave me the slot, and I would do half an hour a day with a guest or just one of my friends doing half an hour or 15, 20 minutes. And it completely, and because also I was sort of thinking, it was a show in the corner of the lobby of a youth hostel, where they just literally put up some chipboard to sort of stop the sound bleed.
Wow.
They didn't feel like there were any stakes, and it felt a bit like I was doing a double act show with Tom, and that was the show that we'd really focused on and we were really happy with and we were really proud of and we'd worked really hard at. And I just thought, if I'm doing this, there's no point in me just going up and doing the same crappy material that has been stinking up the club circuit. And so then I just binned all of it and started writing stuff that I wasn't actively embarrassed by. And that was and that was the start of me starting to actually have really like a run of good gigs. And that is the nice thing about stand-up, is you sort of realize the audience lets you know that you're improving. Yeah. And then 2 years later, I did my first, I signed with an agent who, and this deal didn't really exist anymore, but in terms of the financial consequences of doing Edinburgh and doing festivals, they paid for my first 3 Edinburghs. You know, there were no questions asked. They fronted all the costs and they absorbed all the loss. And that absolutely changed my life, really, because then I did an hour in Edinburgh, and I came to Leicester in 2012 for the first time and did an hour there. Went very badly, I have to tell you, Geoff, very badly indeed.
Sorry, it wasn't my fault.
It was not your fault at all. It was absolutely my fault. But yeah, then I did my first Edinburgh, and that went well. Like, it wasn't like a sort of rip roaring success, but it went well, and it went well enough for me to be able to get bookings in weekend clubs around the country, and that was the thing that made me able to quit my office jobs. And then I went back again, did another solo show in 2013, and then for just a couple of years I was just in the cycle of, you know, you start previewing a show in Leicester in February, and then you take it through the year up to Edinburgh, and then I did that 3 times, and things improved slightly every year. And by things, I mean the quality of the shows, the sort of audience reception and the critical reception at these festivals, and then slowly the numbers that were turning up. You know, but by show 3, I was able to sort of sell out the same 80-seat room that I'd seen Greg Davis in 2006. In 2014, we were able to sell that out, and then I started going to sort of international festivals and started going to Melbourne, and then in 2015, I did a show that in Edinburgh that got nominated for the award, and then I toured that show. And in 2015, I started to do some bits and stuff on TV. I'd done like a couple of little things, like Stuart Lee had me on his Comedy Central show, the Alternative Comedy Experience. That was the first TV thing I ever did. And which I always have to say, because I owe him a big old debt of gratitude, because he was under no pressure to book me for that. No one was saying, somebody's got to get Kumar on TV. This has got to happen. He just saw me at a gig and decided he liked me.
Can we come back to telly just in a sec? I just want to ask, if I can, through all those, you know, so maybe there was, I don't know, 5-6 years that you've just kind of gone through in terms of working your way up, getting an agent, didn't really work out, getting another agent worked better, trying out stuff, not knowing whether you're any good, all of that time, right? Where do you get your where did you get your support from? Where did you was it you've talked about some other comedians that are mates and are friends, but where, you know, I'm interested in, how did you know you were any good? But I'm also interested in, just on a day-to-day basis, you were doing an office job, you said, you know, where's your support come from? Where has that encouragement come from?
I'll be honest with you, I lent very heavily on my friends and my peer group at the time. I started doing comedy in an era where I do think it was a different tone of sort of, there were more opportunities for people to do telly. So I think there was less competitiveness at its core. And also, you know, it was the start of the comedy circuit not really exclusively just being white dudes. No offense, Geoff. You know I'm a big fan of your work as a community.
Sorry.
But it was the start of it being, you know, there being women in comedy, and the start of there being multiple people from ethnic minorities. Again, because of the kind of hard work that the sort of pioneers, you know, Lenny Henry and French and Saunders, the real McCoy, goodness gracious me, the thing that the breakthroughs that they'd all made, we were the sort of first generation that came in. But and it was just a very supportive group of people. And, you know, Ed Gamble, Tom Neenan, James Acaster, Josh Widdicombe, Sarah Pascoe, Aisling B, Kath Ryan, Romesh, we all started at a very similar time. And we were all everyone was just very supportive of each other. Daniel Simonsen was who lives in the States now, was a real mate of mine at the, was a really good friend and was a real source of support in the early years. And certainly it would often be, when I was at a low ebb, it would often be my friends going, no, I think, and I think they just liked me. Personally, I don't think that any of them necessarily had any sense that it was, this was going to work out for me. But they were all the people that really buoyed me along.
And your family, your parents were supportive. I mean,
my parents were baffled. My parents were absolutely baffled, and they were always really it just comes from a place of just absolute concern, because the whole time they were sort of a bit like, I'm not sure this is good, what you should be doing, only because they were just really, it's a classic immigrant fear. And it's all very logical, where the whole point is that you're supposed to come here, do whatever job you can, support your family. And then the next generation is supposed to work in some sort of job that makes them indispensable to the country. And so then you feel that you're in the process of integrating. And I think their attitude was very much like, yes, maybe your kids or your grandkids are the generation that will be able to go and be creative and do whatever they want. But you guys need to be doctors, lawyers, accountants, just any profession that is essential. And that was seen as a pathway to integration. So I think my parents were always just very concerned about my career choice. But I was definitely, and then you would just have the odd good gig. You'd have the odd gig that would go so well, you think it would trick you into thinking you were good. Yeah. And that's really all you need to sustain you for the first couple of years, is the odd good gig. And then over the sort of, I would say between 2007 to 10, you sort of, it was only after 2010 when I really started focusing and working harder on the material, and like, what is the actual, are the jokes good enough? Then suddenly there was a jump, and I would go from having one amazing gig in maybe 5, and then 4 really tricky ones, and then 1. Then suddenly the ratio started shifting in my favor, and you suddenly start to notice, the audience is really responding well. Every other gig now, I'm actually having a pretty good time. And also, it isn't just, you start realizing your threshold for what constitutes a good gig starts to change. And you start realizing, I had a gig that 2 years ago I'd have been really happy with, but actually now I realize that I can get much more out of the audience. I can make this material much denser with jokes and much denser with laughs. And the laughs start getting bigger and more frequent and closer together. And it's, there is, comedians, we sort of love to kind of myth make around our profession, but there is just a lot of craft involved, and there is just a lot of, because it's one of the only art forms where you're actually reacting to data. You can quantify how the gigs are going, and you start recording gigs, and then you start listening to the gigs, and the two do not go together. Let me tell you, there was a lot of years where I was like, I record every gig, and I just didn't fucking listen to a single one. As soon as you start listening to them, you go, well, that doesn't work. That needs to go. Yeah. That needs to be changed. And then really from sort of 2010 to 12, the numbers started to turn in my favor in terms of how many good gigs I was having and then suddenly you stop. I can probably tell you all the good gigs that I had between 2007 and 2010. and then you suddenly start thinking, I don't actually remember each individual success anymore, because they're all sort of blurring into one. But those years are, they are tricky. 2007 to 12 was kind of half a decade of experimentation, failure. And through that period, I was definitely you know, I was definitely buoyed up by my contemporaries, who were very supportive. And there was a real sense that we were all in this together.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear. I don't particularly want to dwell on this massively because I'm having spent nearly 3 decades of producing a live festival. I'm more interested in live comedy than I am in terms of TV. But you touched on the kind of the Stuart Lee TV thing as and obviously you've had success on TV. Was that always part of you talked a minute ago about kind of stopping having a game plan and focusing more on your stand-up and your material.
Yeah.
I'm slightly putting words into your mouth, but did you always want to be on telly, or was that just something that came up over time as a natural development of your career?
I think there's sort of, because the first time you see comedy when you're a teenager is on television, there's sort of a natural part of you that thinks, well, that's obviously the logical endpoint. You know, watching Ross and Oberlin Have I Got News for You was one of the first times that I sort of thought, oh, look at that comedian there, you know, and it definitely, you can't help but make that part of your ambition because that's the first place that you saw comedy. But then when you start, but like I say, abandoning the, in inverted commas, game plan such as it was what helped me, and just knuckling down and focusing on the work was what helped me. And you know, and in around sort of 2013-14, when I'd done a couple of good Edinburghs and I didn't have to do a day job anymore, there was definitely a part of me that just thought, well, this is fine, this is great, this is absolutely great. Like I you know, if I'm able to do Edinburgh and do a sort of small tour and then go to somewhere like Melbourne and then work your year around, you know, Leicester in February, Melbourne and then you can fit Edinburgh and then a tour. And then also when I'm not touring, then doing weekend gigs, you sort of look at it and go, oh, this is, you know, this is great. This is absolutely perfect. And just as I was sort of thinking that, then some TV opportunities started to sort of fall into my lap. But the game plan went out the window a long time ago, and the focus just shifted on make the thing as good as possible. And you know, one of the best things about doing TV is that it creates a larger live audience. And so, you know, last year when I went on tour, doing stand-up in theatres was the most artistically and professionally satisfying thing I've done in my career. It was the most fun.
Yeah. I think I'm right in saying, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, I think you have called yourself a left-wing comedian. So
yeah, I did. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Good. So what's from the very beginning, did you want to have a kind of particularly social message in your comedy? Is that important to you? Is that just a kind of, because that's, if you're left wing, that might be more natural? What have you tried to use your comedy to try and say anything?
Well, I just think that I really loved watching people make comedy out of serious issues. Just because it made me, when I was a kid, it made me feel, you know, Chris Rock doing stand-up about racism, or a goodness gracious me sketch about racism, is one of the things that made me feel better, because it makes you feel like you're in control. If you're taking these kind of big, scary issues and making comedy out of them, I found that very empowering. And so I had that was something that I always wanted to do. You know, I watched a lot of The Daily Show when I was at college, and that definitely had an impact. You know, I think one of the chief joys of a good comedy gig is that you could get 4 people on a bill that have completely different, that, you know, one of the most enjoyable things is just watching Tim Vine capering around and make weird bad puns and then sort of celebrate them with a nonsense song. You know, that's what's more enjoyable than that. You know, it's so great. And I think the fact that some comedians do engage with social issues and some comedians are just making people absolutely howl with laughter, talking about something very mundane or something extremely weird, is one of the sort of chief pleasures of stand-up. I get very antsy when I hear somebody have a very cast iron definition of what stand-up should be. You know, it's just a microphone and the truth, and you kind of think, please, the truth had better be funny, because that's what I've come out for. You know, like it's yeah. So I never felt under any obligation, but there was so much of the comedy that really sparked my imagination when I was a kid, dealt in social issues. And so a lot of it was about working out how to do that. And because it is really hard, it's very hard to make your opinions funny. And it was something that I sort of learned how to do over a number of years. And then was really accelerated by my first sort of broadcast job was hosting Newsjack, which is a Radio 4 Extra open submission show. And every week I'd have to write a monologue for that about the news. And that was one of the things that really helped me sort of drill down into how to write comedy about the news. Like I was sort of learning how to do it as I went along. But I like to take big, serious subjects and make comedy about them, because I think for me, growing up, that was always a helpful way to process what was happening around me. But I would never confuse what I've done in comedy for activism. And I think there are comics, you know, Mark Thomas, Josie Long, there are comedians who I love very deeply, who have done things that I think you could genuinely call genuine, legitimate activism, you know. And I wouldn't deign to call myself one of, like, I wouldn't say that I've ever successfully moved anyone's mind on anything. But yeah, I do. That's the stuff that I like. You know, I always loved the way that the Simpsons dealt with politics, and I always loved. You know, I loved seeing Stuart Lee in 2007 sort of doing that he had a whole routine about Richard Littlejohn, and you know, some absolutely appalling and objectionable column that he'd written. And I loved watching someone just really take a point that I agreed with, but drive it home with just really great jokes.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think a lot of people may just watch comedy on TV. A lot of people might know there's a live circuit. I think you sort of touched on some of this before, I think, but I think there's more than one live circuit. It's often called the mainstream circuit, but I also think there's a very different type of black comedy circuit and an Asian comedy circuit as well. And again, I think I'm right in saying that you've done Asian gigs and you also done mainstream gigs as well. Is there a difference between the two? Do you have to have different type of material for? It feels a bit weird calling it the Asian circuit.
Yeah, no, I think the thing is, I think that there is something really amazing about watching somebody who can adapt their act. That's not really a skill I have. I kind of have what I have, and then you just have to you just have to try and make it. And it is funny. There is something really satisfying about a drunk audience on a Friday and Saturday night looking at your set list and going, I've got quite a bit of stuff about privatization in here. I don't really have anything else to talk about, so I'm going to have to try and make this work. And there is something incredibly satisfying about doing material that you consider to sort of be about like social issues or in any vague way cerebral, but getting the jokes to be so bulletproof that you can do it to a drunk audience and have it work. That is really satisfying. It is it is a really skillful thing to be able to adjust your material. I think you can either go one of two ways. You can either have a skill set that allows you to adjust your material, or if you're like me and you're like, I kind of only got one thing. I can kind of do one thing sort of well. So then the challenge is to make that thing work in lots of different rooms and contexts. And that is one of the most interesting and stimulating challenges about being a comedian, is that you sort of waft through Asian gigs and weekend club gigs, and then more sort of, arty, there's a whole other sort of old circuit of alternative gigs. And I've always wanted to be a comedian that could happily move through any of those rooms and be involved in all of those scenes. Again, because I like the variety. I like diversity in comedy in every sense. I like comedy that's representative of the wider public, because if you get somebody whose background you have no clue about, you might just learn something totally new and wild and different. But I also like lots of different types of comedy. Like, I love to go and see some weird sketch show. I love to go and see, there's something really pleasurable about watching, somebody just like watching Paul Sinha in a comedy club is like, it is so great, because he's doing really cerebral stuff, but he's not compromising the act, but he's still making people just absolutely howl with laughter. And that is really, watching somebody just have the jokes and just smash through 20 minutes in a gig is amazing. But I love watching festival-y shows, and I absolutely love watching something like Nanette and what Hannah Gadsby was able to achieve. I found the sort of slightly hostile reception to that kind of baffling, because to me, what she was doing was expanding the vocabulary of what was possible in a 1-hour comedy show. And that to me is so exciting. It's so thrilling to go and watch Bridget Christie at 11:30 in the morning at the Stand do comedy about FGM. It doesn't get more serious as a subject than that. It doesn't get, whenever I hear people talk about edgy, in inverted commas, comedy, I'm always like, you should watch fucking Bridget Christie. That's the fucking edgiest comedy I've ever seen in my life. It's in terms of contentious subject matter. The Chappelle 846 half hour, whatever it was, about George Floyd was absolutely extraordinary. Not a lot of laughs in places. In a lot of places, a really powerful essay about race relations almost, but so extraordinary, so incredible. And the idea that the comedy circuit, the idea that this umbrella of comedy could encompass Hannah Gadsby, Tim Vine, Chris Rock, Mitch Hedberg, and Andy Kaufman. The idea that all those people are doing the same job is so cool, and it's exactly why I love, particularly live comedy. The idea that all those people are, the idea that all those people are like, without wishing to denigrate the profession, an accountant is an accountant, and you've got like a criminal barrister and a solicitor, and roughly lots of lawyers are doing, there's like nuances and details within the work, but the wild variance between, even if you look at like actors, there's like dramatic and comedic actors, and they're quite different skill sets. If you look at the breadth of what is going on under the term of somebody saying I'm a comedian, it's wild. It's absolutely, the variance is just incredible, and that variety is what keeps it fresh and keeps it exciting for me.
I don't know whether you did this deliberately or not, but when you just said actor, you did have a bit of disgust in your tone.
Listen,
Actors.
nobody loves actors more than me. Nobody loves actors more than me. You know, like
You know, it's like
no one is missing the cinema more than I am. But it's it just is such an interesting thing about how really you are. It is it's a hell of a blank canvas, the sort of comedy club. You know, you really are just you really are basically left to your own devices, and you have to find a way to make an audience laugh, and whatever way you choose to make them laugh is legitimate.
So two final questions then. Maybe I'm opening a whole can of worms at this point. So if you're watching at home, strap in for another 2 hours of this. But so at the moment, there's this whole campaign to save live comedy, because it's as important as drummers and actors. What you've kind of touched on this already, really, I suppose. But in terms of contemporary Britain, in terms of contemporary United Kingdom, and the diversity of the country and contemporary culture, live comedy should be saved as much as opera and dance and theatre.
I think it's absolutely essential. I think that the difficulty is, and I'm not insensitive to these concerns, because I have lots of friends that write theatre and are involved in the theatre. And the thing about Comedy and Arts Council funding traditionally has been, there hasn't been a huge amount of it, because comedy, because of the expenses involved, doesn't require the kind of start-up capital. And so you can understand why there's an argument for arts funding not really landing in comedy up to the point of the pandemic. Now I think it's absolutely essential that the government makes funding available to keep venues open and makes avenues available for, because a terrible outcome of this would be, and it is something that I'm worried, we're all concerned about at the moment, is the idea that it just stand-up should be, in theory, egalitarian. Now, in practice, it's not become that at all. And, that will only be worsened if the government doesn't make funds available to keep venues open, and also to make sure that the subsidies and furlough schemes are maintained for artists and comedians. Because if the government doesn't intervene, then there'll be a whole generation of comics that just has to go back to day jobs, and it will only be people who are independently wealthy that can survive in the industry. I'm by no means, it would be a bold claim, by which I mean a flat outright lie, for me to claim that I have in any way struggled in my life, that I come from anything, that I come from any sort of anything approaching poverty. I've lived a very, very comfortable life. But even for me, the only reason I was able to do Edinburgh was because my old management company paid those fees. Because otherwise you're looking at an outlay of 10 grand, and that's, that, and there was a period where it felt like things were changing in Edinburgh. Certainly in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, the Free Fringe is its own huge thing now. And it did feel like people were thinking more consciously about how can we help make class one of the things that isn't an obstacle to being a comedian. You have to think about how we can help make race, class, gender and sexuality not be a factor in whether you decide to be a comedian, because it shouldn't. And it should be the most egalitarian, because of the theoretical lack of a need for startup capital. It should be a truly egalitarian art form. But the only way that's going to be maintained after we come out of this is if there is government funding available, and if comedy is afforded the status of art. It always reminds me of Simon Munnery used to have a routine where he was once described by a critic as being the closest thing comedy came to art. and he said that his mission statement was now to no longer be good at comedy, but to be shit at art.
Yeah. And what's next? What's next for you? We've talked a little bit today about the fact that you don't have a kind of, or you stopped having a game plan and then you focused on your writing.
So at the moment, I'm making a show for an app called Quibi. That's a twice a week, 8 to 10 minute episodes, giving a sort of British perspective on the American political situation as they lead up to the election. I mean, the plan for the show was for it to be about the lead up to the election, but obviously now the pandemic has shifted it. And so I'll basically be doing that until the end of the year. And then who knows? I don't know what happens next. It sort of depends on, there's sort of two things. It sort of depends on commissioners and what they decide, whether they decide to, whether we get brought back for another MASH report. We'll have to hear about that from the BBC. Whether this thing with Quibi goes beyond the election is something I'll have to wait to hear about. And then just counting down until I can do a tour again, and get back doing. I was talking to my friend after I did the car park gig, which I really enjoyed. And I sort of, again, I'm so wary about people romanticizing stand-up and being like, it's like an addiction and like, it's like a need that you have to be up on stage. And I was talking to my friend and I was like, I do, because I don't want that to be the case. Because I think as with everything, we over-romanticize our jobs, too much, comedians, definitely. But there's definitely this part of me that was like, man, I really enjoyed doing that again. And my friend was like, yeah, of course. It's that thing you've been doing since you were 21 years old that is part of how you process things that are happening around you. Of course, you feel better having done it. And the tour, the last tour that I did, I'm not changing anyone's minds, Geoff, politically. No one who's come to see me leaves with anything other than their core beliefs reinforced. I am achieving a solid just consensus in the room. But it did feel very cathartic doing the shows and talking about everything that was going on. Back when the political situation seemed to be something that was important. Everything seems just less significant, when the death toll is reaching, once the death toll starts getting into like the hundreds, everything else stops being important. And often friends of mine who would come and see the show would say, are you not exhausted by just yelling and screaming about everything that you think is going wrong? And I would always say, no, I find it really cathartic because the audience is reacting. And I found the shows very cathartic for me. I hope the audience did as well. But obviously my priority is my own well-being. And so getting up in front of an audience again and being able to sort of talk about what's been happening in the last few weeks, it did definitely make me feel better. And that's what I'm in this for, Geoff. I'm here to make myself feel better.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. It's been great catching up with you and having a chat.
Not at all, Geoff. I have a deep reservoir of affection for Leicester as a city, and for the Comedy Festival as well. So I'm always happy to catch up.
Thank you, Nish. That's great. Well, take care of yourself, and
you too.
Hopefully we'll see each other at a gig at some point in the future.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers, Nish. Bye.